In this video, we will be learning about properties of real numbers. You'll probably find this video very easy because properties and the identities are very logical and you probably already know it. Now we're just going to make some very important observations for future math. And you will have to know this logic. You'll probably forget the name in a year or two, or maybe just in a year. But it is very important that you understand the logic behind this. So the first one is a commutative property. The textbook definition is going to be very unhelpful because it makes it very complicated when it doesn't really need to be. Basically, for addition and multiplication, the order in which you add or multiply does not matter. So let's say 2 plus 3.5. That's going to be the same thing as 3.5 plus 2. The second example, 1/2 plus 7 is the same thing as 7 plus 1/2. Now for multiplication, it's going to work the same exact way. 3 times 5 is going to be the same thing as 5 times 3. Same exact thing. So basically, 5 times something is the same thing as something times 5. And the way we like to put it in algebra is 5 times x equals x times 5, the number we don't know, the variable. And also you're going to see a lot of these dots for multiplication if you haven't seen them already. Okay. Now for the associative property. Again, this definition will not be very helpful. I'm not even going to review it. So, addition and multiplication again. What basically the associative property is, the parentheses are ways of grouping numbers, and basically it doesn't matter how you group them. You're going to add them all at the end. So 2 plus parentheses 3.5 plus 1.3 is the same thing as grouping them another way. 2 plus 3.5 plus 1.3. Here we group 3.5, 1.3. Here we group 2 plus 3.5. It's going to be the same thing. At the end, they're all going to be added. And then it's going to work the same exact way for multiplication. 6 times 18 times 7 is going to be the same exact thing. Because they're all going to be multiplied at the end. So it doesn't matter how you group them. It's basically what the associative property is. You can remember it because we associate these numbers together and we associate those. When everything's being added and when everything's being multiplied, it doesn't matter how you associate them. That's what this property is about. Now for the additive identity. This is going to be the most basic thing you've ever seen. And the textbook definition is going to be a lot bit overly complicated. So basically, 1 plus 0 is 1 because 0 plus anything is going to be that same number. That's the additive identity. So a number that's not 0 plus 0 is the number that's not 0. That's the additive identity. So for another example, 3 plus 0 is 3. If you add a number with 0, it's going to stay that same number. The multiplicative identity is going to be like somewhat of a similar identity like this, but for multiplication. Again, the textbook definition is going to get more and more complicated when it gets even easier. Basically, a number that's not 0 times 1 is going to be the number that's not 0. It can even be 0 actually. 0 times 1 is 0. For example, 8 times 1 is still going to be 8, and 1 times 7 is still going to be 7. A number times 1 is still the number that's not 1. Or 1. It can even be 1. 1 times 1 is still 1. Now, the multiplicative property of 0. The textbook definition is pretty friendly for this one. Any number that when multiplied by 0 gives the product of 0. A number that's not 0 times 0 equals 0. It can actually be any number. It can be even 0 too. So for example, 1 times 0 is 0. 3 times 0 is 0. Pretty easy. Anything times 0 is 0. Now for the additive inverse. It's pretty easy. The textbook definition is pretty friendly. A number that when added to a given number results in a sum of 0. The opposite of a number. Might be a little bit too difficult actually. But basically a number plus its opposite, so you basically just make it into a negative, or if it's a negative already, you make it into a positive, and you add these two numbers together, it's 0. That might be a little bit difficult to understand, but it's really easy. 5 minus 5, so the positive 5 plus its opposite side, so like the negative 5, is going to be 0. And then 1, and then it's added to its opposite inverse would be -1, would still be 0. It's basically like 1 minus 1, 5 minus 5. That's basically the additive inverse. Now for the multiplicative inverse. This is going to be pretty easy, but a lot of people are going to get confused, and you just have to follow along a little bit. It's kind of going to be like the one we just looked at. The reciprocal of a number that when multiplied by a given number results in a product of 1. For example, 7 times 1 over 7 is 1. So a number times 1 over, or like you flip it over kind of, because this number is already over 1, times you flip it over, 1 over the number is going to be 1. So basically what we do, it might be a little bit confusing, but you have to remember that a number is already a number over 1. So what the reciprocal is in this case, you flip it over. So now it's going to be 1 over that number. And then you multiply them together and you get 1. That's going to be the multiplicative inverse. And another example of this would be if it's already in a fraction, 2 over 3, you would flip it over and you would get 3 over 2. That would be the reciprocal of this one. And then you would multiply them together and you would get 1. So basically, a over b times the reciprocal b over a will get 1. That's basically the multiplicative inverse. Okay, now for the distributive property. This is going to be the most important thing you will need to know, and it's going to be a little bit difficult compared to the other ones we saw. So basically, let's read the textbook definition. I think it's going to be somewhat helpful. A property of real numbers. Whenever you see this, just ignore it basically. And that states, so that's still more fluff. The product of the sum or difference of two numbers is the same as the sum of the difference of their products. Okay, that might not be helpful. To some it might be helpful, but basically we have 2 or a number outside being multiplied by the parentheses with something inside. And what we do is, well, you could add these 2 inside, you would get 19, and then multiply it by 2 and get the answer. But what we could also do, and it will come very handy when you get to more difficult numbers, especially if you don't know what a number in here is, if it's a variable, is that you multiply the outside 2 by 15, and then you add that with 2 times 4. So 2 times 15 plus 2 times 4. That's the same thing. This expression, or this side, is the same thing as this side, hence the equal sign. And it's the same thing over here. So 4 times 12 minus, because of this minus, 4 times 8. That's going to be the same exact thing as this side. It's just being represented differently. So we multiply the outside in, and we add it with the other side. But in this case, because it is negative, it turns the positive and negative. That's going to be a distributive property. This is very important, and you'll see it come up a lot. And you have a lot of practice with it, so you don't have to worry about it too much. Okay, now let's do some examples and practice. Tell whether each statement is true or false. You can pause the video and try it yourself. I'm going to continue. Okay, A, 4 plus 3 equals 3 plus 4. Because of the commutative property, that is true. That's really easy. That's like almost a picture-perfect example of the commutative property. 10 times 4 equals 4 times 10. Another commutative property, true. Very easy. Another picture-perfect example. This one is false. You might see it, you might think, well, it's different arrangement, so it must be the same. But this is not the commutative property. And you could even check your work by actually doing the 6 minus 8, which will be minus 2. and 8 minus 6, which would be positive 2. So these are not equal because one is negative. And this is because the commutative property only works when two things are being added, or the numbers are being added or multiplied. And in this case, there's a negative. There's a subtraction. So it does not work. So this is false. B. 6 times 0 equals 0 times 9. Because of the multiplicative property of 0, 6 times 0 is 0. 0 times 9 is 0. So they're both equal. This is true. E. Okay. We would get 35 with the additive identity if you still need that. I think this is pretty easy. And then on this other side, we can do the multiplicative identity and we would get 35. So 35 equals 35. So this is true. We actually had to do two different identities, but I think it was pretty easy and logical to get to without even needing to know this. Okay, this one's going to be false. 13 plus 0 equals 13 times 0 is not true. Okay, so 13 plus 0, because of the additive identity, we'll get 13. 13 times 0, because the multiplicative property of 0, would get 0. And 13 does not equal 0. False. Now we've learned properties of real numbers. Thank you for watching the video. If you found it helpful, give it a like and subscribe.